Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions. How do we best explain moral obligation?
Yeah, well, think about an analogy here. Let's say you're eating at your favorite Chinese food restaurant, right? And you open up the fortune cookie, and you pull out the fortune, and the fortune says, "Get up and leave now." That's a command. Now, how many of us would feel an obligation to obey that command that comes out of the fortune cookie? Well, unless you're a weirdo or something, unless you're paranoid, you're not going to feel an obligation that you should obey that command. But notice it's a command. Well, now let's say you're at the Chinese food restaurant and there's a lady at the table next to you, and she looks over at you and says, "Get up and leave now." Are you going to get up and leave now? Do you feel an obligation to leave? Well, no, I think you're probably going to ask a question first. You're going to say, well, who are you? Why are you telling me to get up and leave? What if she says, "Well, I'm just another customer here, but I don't really like you. I want you to get up and leave." Well, you're going to say, "Oh, no, I don't have any obligation to leave because you don't like me." But what if that same lady says, "I'm an FBI agent, and we're about to bust the owner of this Chinese food restaurant. You better get up and leave now." Then there's an obligation, it seems, to get up and leave now, to obey that command. Now notice, in each one of those situations, you have the same exact command. But in the first two situations, you don't feel an obligation. You don't think there's an obligation to obey the command. But in the third one, you do think there's an obligation to obey that command. Well, why? Well, because in the third situation, you have an appropriate authority that backs up the command, and therefore brings into existence this obligation. Well, in the same way, when we look kind of into the universe, when we realize and reflect and say, okay, we do have obligations. We have obligations to one another. We have obligations to creation. There are these moral obligations that we have. What would best explain a moral obligation? Well, it seems like the commands of God constitute our obligations, and so there has to be an appropriate authority. God is that appropriate authority that makes sense of moral obligation.